History as it happens, November 30th, 2021. Putin's gamble.
The United States' commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity is ironclad.
Very important that the United States stand by Ukraine in our efforts to defend our sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of the ongoing Russian aggression.
7 years after annexing Crimea and instigating a separatist rebellion in eastern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is amassing 100,000 troops on the border, and that's raising the specter of war once more. The U.S. vows to defend Ukraine, and that's raising an important question. Why is that country in Eastern Europe, a former Soviet republic, so important to the United States? A country whose relationship to Russia is steeped in a complicated, bloody history American leaders have often overlooked. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
The problem is it is this weasel word, if you like, democracy and choice, which then in American public discourse somehow cancels out the need for strategic thought.
So here we are in late 2021, a year that'll be remembered for the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. And we have the possibility of a new conflict arriving. U.S. officials believe Russia could invade its neighbor Ukraine early next year, because Vladimir Putin is apparently unhappy with the peace process set up by European powers in 2014 after he annexed Crimea and sparked a separatist revolt in eastern Ukraine, a war that's claimed at least 14,000 Ukrainian lives. So American and European diplomats are now scrambling to convince Russia to back off, but it's not clear Putin can be stopped if he decides to attack. And that brings us to another question. Why Ukraine? Ukraine is not in Western Europe, the home base, if you will, of NATO. Well, neither was Turkey, but Turkey joined NATO during the early years of the Cold War for reasons that don't apply to this situation. So again, why Ukraine? Is its independence a vital U.S. national security interest? Given its complicated historical relationship with Russia, one that goes back centuries, why would the U.S. want to get tangled up in that? As our guest today puts it, the U.S. got trapped along the path of NATO expansion, the expansion of the West.
The problem was that having declared that this wasn't about strategy and it wasn't about defense against Russia, it was all about democracy and the democratic choice of nations and that nobody could deny them this democratic choice, America left itself with no argument whereby it could say, now we stop. This is too far. We can't defend these places.
And that is Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. You can find the roots of this ideological commitment to NATO expansion, the spread of American and democratic ideals, in the words of President George H.W. Bush in 1991, on the very day the Soviet Union collapsed. The unique characteristics and histories of the countries involved mattered little if you saw the world as a place where your own values are universal values and therefore are simply waiting for the rest of the world to embrace them.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values. The United States applauds and supports the historic choice for freedom by the new states of the Commonwealth. We congratulate them on the peaceful and democratic path they have chosen and for their careful attention to nuclear control and safety during this transition. Our enemies have become our partners, committed to building democratic and civil societies. They ask for our support, and we will give it to them.
So Ukraine only gained its independence in 1991. For centuries, it was essentially divided in two. Its western half claimed by Europe, its eastern half by Russia. But even that formulation may be too simplistic. As historian Serhiy Yakelchik put it, what it means to be Ukrainian is still a fluid concept. Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union actively assimilated Ukrainians into a larger imperial space. But at the same time, a distinct Ukrainian nationalism developed in resistance to outside control. Many ethnic Russians live in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, further complicating the notion of a Ukraine independent from Russia. And to this day, Moscow has not come to terms with Ukrainian nationhood because that idea deprives Russia of its great imperial past, at least in the minds of the nationalists who care about such things. On top of independence achieved in 1991, in 2014, Ukrainians overthrew their pro-Russian government. Led by Viktor Yanukovych in a bloody revolution, the pro-Western government is now led by Vladimir Zelensky, whose name you'll remember from the first Trump impeachment drama. Let's try to unravel this complex ethnic, linguistic, and historical knot with Anatol Lieven, a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He joins us for a third time on History as It Happens. Anatol Lieven, welcome back.
Hello.
Why has Russia been reluctant, if that is the correct word to use, reluctant to recognize a separate nationhood for Ukraine?
Russia and Ukraine have been tied together. The Ukrainians, of course, would say Ukraine has been ruled by Russia for many centuries. Beyond that, Russians trace their statehood to the early medieval kingdom of Rus, which was actually based in Kiev, which is now the Ukrainian capital. And there's a tremendously deep contacts between the populations. Throughout Russia, a very large part of the population of Siberia is of Ukrainian origin. Many people are married to Ukrainians. Many Ukrainians are married to Russians. About a third of the Ukrainian population speaks Russian as its first language. So you have these very close ties. And Russia regards Ukraine as a country to lose which would, to a great extent, destroy Russia's position on the international stage and undermine a key aspect of Russian history. But there's also the strategic aspect. Russia regards a Ukraine in NATO in very much the same way that America would regard Mexico in a military alliance with China and with Chinese military bases. I don't think that the United States would respond very well to that prospect. Russia is not responding well to the idea of Ukraine as a military ally of the United States.
These historical complexities did not go away during the Soviet era, but they were buried to a certain extent because of the Soviet domination of the region. Ukraine won its independence probably for the first time, right, in 1991? Was that the first modern independent Ukrainian state?
Pretty much, because it was quasi-independent under German protection at the end of the Second World War, but not really.
So that brought the question back out into the open again. Ukraine is, in essence, split, right, between its eastern and western halves, even as an independent state, culturally, linguistically.
Well, the east and south of Ukraine was not historically Ukrainian because it was open steppe, actually dominated by Tatars, until the Russian conquest in the 18th century, when it was settled chiefly by Ukrainians, but also by large numbers of Russians, Germans, until Stalin deported them, Bulgarians. And this area of eastern and southern Ukraine, for many years, has mostly spoken Russian. And in the 25 years between Ukrainian independence, between the fall of the Soviet Union and the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, Ukrainian governments swung to and fro, but really, the change in the vote was only 2 or 3%, between parties based in Western Ukraine, much more ethnic nationalist, much more anti-Russian, and parties based in Eastern and Southern Ukraine, much more pro-Russian. That stopped with 2014, when, of course, the revolution overthrew the final pro-Russian government. But a great many people, not just in the areas now occupied by Russia or by pro-Russian separatists, but more widely, still do want good relations with Russia. They would like to join the West, but they would like to do so in a way that does not destroy their relationship with Russia. And above all, they're not happy with these measures of Ukrainianization, because the Ukrainian state is taking tougher and tougher measures to try to drive Russia out of public life, out of education, out of public services, even out of shops. You see this all over the world, but it's relatively rare that such a large proportion of the population, speaks a different language. That is also a cause of great tension.
This question of either part of Europe or part of a Russian empire, if you will, seems like the wrong question in a place where national identities are so fluid. As I was preparing for this conversation, I noted the importance of linguistic nationalism, where Ukrainians were expected to speak Russian, and this goes back to the Tsarist days, maybe even before. But Russian's not Ukrainian, so I guess that also helps explain some of the cultural tensions at work here.
Ukrainian nationalists see themselves as simply redressing an old historical injustice and an old state-mandated prejudice in favor of Russian. So one can understand that. One also has to understand why Russia is deeply unhappy with this and pushes back against it. Many people have argued that it would be better to recognize Ukraine as a neutral state, if you will, between Russia and the West, since it is so deeply divided. But that, of course, is utterly unacceptable to Ukrainian nationalists.
So now we have a pro-Western government in Kiev. That seems to have inflamed the situation, as well as the offer for Ukraine to become part of NATO. In 2014, Vladimir Putin gave a speech in which he expressed his bewilderment at the very existence of a Ukrainian state. He claimed that for reasons he could not understand. He said he could not understand why the Bolsheviks created the Soviet Ukrainian Republic in the 1920s, including the traditional territories of New Russia, capital N, capital R. What was he getting at there?
Well, some Russians would like simply to abolish Ukraine altogether. Others would be happy with a united, neutral Ukraine. Others, of course, want a united Ukraine in close alliance with Russia. That was Putin's hope before 2014. But there are also Russian nationalists who would like to divide Ukraine and take back these areas which in Russia are called Novorossiya, New Russia, on the grounds that they were never historically Ukrainian and were only, according to the Russians, liberated from the Crimean Tatars by Catherine the Great. So that is a threat that hangs over a united Ukrainian statehood. And Putin revives this every now and again, not necessarily as a serious plan, because militarily speaking, the Russians could have done this in 2014. There was nothing to stop them in military terms. They didn't. They pursued, still an aggressive, but a much more limited agenda. But this possibility is still there. And there has been a good deal more talk of it this year in the Russian media, and much more aggressive and angry language coming out of Moscow. That's why people, including myself, are taking this latest flurry of alarm more seriously than others in recent years.
There's been a low-level civil war, a separatist civil war on the eastern side of Ukraine going on for 7 years now. So some are concerned that the Russian troop buildup might be a sign that Putin wants to end this low-level civil war once and for all. For what end? To establish a route to Crimea, to conquer part of eastern Ukraine?
Well, it could well be that these Russian troop movements are just saber-rattling, a way of putting pressure on the Ukrainians, of putting pressure on the West, of trying to bring America to really throw its weight behind a political compromise over the Donbass based on this Minsk agreement of 2015, which was signed by the Russians, the Ukrainians, the French and the Germans, and endorsed by America, but the details of which were left vague and have failed to be implemented. The basis of the Minsk agreement is the only possible political solution, which is full autonomy for the Donbass, this region of eastern Ukraine, under Ukrainian sovereignty, but under international guarantees and with some kind of international peacekeeping force. Recently, it has been Ukraine mainly that has refused to implement this because the Ukrainians fear that such an autonomous Donbass would be able to block Ukraine's progress towards NATO and the European Union if it remained within Ukraine. Now, of course, Russia might also in the end block an agreement, but the way things stand, it is in fact the Ukrainians. So the possibility exists, and I think this is what the Russians are trying to achieve by their military movements, that America could actually try to push the Ukrainians into this agreement. Now, of course, if they don't, then the question becomes whether indeed Russia will invade. Russia would pay a very heavy price economically and politically. The European Union would introduce really harsh sanctions. The Nord Stream gas pipeline to Germany would go out of the window. So there are big disincentives to doing that. But, on the other hand, Putin might well reckon that essentially this is the only chance to keep a large part of Ukraine allied to Russia, and also that this would be his greatest historical legacy. Leaders do have these ambitions to resemble great military figures of the past, especially as they get older. My sense is if Russia goes to war and is willing to accept this great economic and political damage that would result, then there is little incentive for Russia to stop. Not to conquer the whole of Ukraine, because then it would land itself with an appalling political problem, but essentially to conquer all those areas of Ukraine that Russia thinks could be turned into a pro-Russian Ukrainian republic. Of course, having done that, the Russians would presumably then try to negotiate on the basis of reuniting Ukraine as a neutral federal state. But my God, there would be a crisis in the meantime.
If Russia does invade, your argument is there's no way to stop that from happening, that they would succeed.
So the Russian army outnumbers the Ukrainian by about 4-1, 10-1 in modern aircraft, at least 5-1 in tanks and with more modern tanks. So many of the Ukrainian units would put up a tough fight. I mean, they are a lot stronger than they were in 2014. They're also a lot more nationalist and highly motivated. But the brute military facts are on Russia's side. And would NATO intervene? It didn't in 2014 to save the Ukrainians. It didn't in 2008 to save the Georgians. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But also, of course, this would involve full-scale war with Russia, a nuclear power. But also, America does not actually have enough ground troops in Europe now to intervene quickly and with strong hope of success. Anyone who thinks that the Germans, the Danes, the Italians are going to fight in Ukraine has really not studied their recent historical record.
No one has the stomach for a war right now either.
Well, no. And of course, within the Pentagon, there is deep concern about this simply because of an awareness that it would be amazing if China did not exploit. I mean, if America goes to war with Russia, I wouldn't give much for Taiwan's chances of survival. So then America finds itself in a two-front war and risks losing both wars. What do we have all these military analysts for if they could not predict this before they started talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO? Can we defend NATO? Will we defend NATO? What would be the costs to America and America's position if America does go to war with Russia?
So let's talk about NATO, because we've been discussing some of the historical issues at stake here and Russia's historic relationship with Ukraine and how it views Ukrainian independence. But from a practical, strategic, current standpoint, this NATO issue has aggravated that situation in ways that we often don't consider here in the United States.
Well, as I say, Russia regards Ukraine in NATO the same way that America would regard a hostile military alliance on its own borders, something that it hasn't really faced since 1812. Of course, the crazy thing is that the semi-plan, vague, quasi-offer of future NATO membership for Ukraine has managed to absolutely infuriate and alarm the Russians, while at the same time, NATO has absolutely no plan for how to defend Ukraine. A member of the NATO headquarters staff explained to me one time that the whole of NATO expansion was sold to the publics in America and in Europe. as something which was going to involve no risks and no extra costs. And indeed, when it came to NATO membership for Poland and the Czech Republic, that was true because Russia has no conceivable interest in attacking them or denying them membership of the West. But from the very start, it should have been obvious. I mean, it was obvious, I would say, to serious analysts of Russia, that if you were going to offer NATO membership to Ukraine, you had to be prepared to fight Russia. If you weren't prepared to do that, don't make the offer.
And this would be a good place to talk about the U.S. relationship with Ukraine. How would you describe it? Because Ukraine is not a treaty ally with the United States, not part of NATO yet. So why does the U.S. support Ukraine with military aid and has become the de facto defender of Ukrainian independence?
Well, America got trapped onto this path of NATO expansion, the expansion of the West. And initially, all of this made excellent sense. As I say, expansion to Poland, even to the Baltic states, countries where you had united nationalisms, pro-Western. But the problem was that having declared that this wasn't about strategy and it wasn't about defense against Russia, it was all about democracy and the democratic choice of nations and that nobody could deny them this democratic choice, America left itself with no argument whereby it could say, now we stop. This is too far. We can't defend these places. We have too many security commitments elsewhere. The problem is it is this weasel word, if you like, democracy and choice, which then in American public discourse somehow cancels out the need for strategic thought and sober consideration of America's vital national interests, which most certainly are not engaged.
And the history between these two places.
Well, yes, the American security establishment just never seriously studied the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And we cannot say that we were not warned. The Russians warned us again and again and again, in public, in private, I've been there, that they would respond with force to a plan to bring Ukraine into NATO. And those objections were simply brushed away. People said, oh, you're not serious, we don't believe it. Well, why not believe it?
Putin must believe he has some leverage here. You mentioned the Nord Stream pipeline for gas and the probability that he would lose that pipeline if he were to invade Ukraine instead of just supporting the insurgency there in the eastern half of the country. But aren't Europe's gas supplies dwindling right now? Doesn't Russia have some leverage over that issue when it comes to the gas pipeline?
Yes, indeed. And obviously that is a Russian calculation that the Europeans simply could not go too far because a complete shutoff of Russian gas to Europe and Europe would freeze. Of course, Russian revenues would also collapse. On the other hand, the Russians are very concerned about moves to alternative energy, about possible huge further development of fracking in the United States. In other words, the long-term effects for Russia might be, well, partly grave in economic terms, but also if Europe did over time move decisively away from Russian gas, then Russia would be put completely into the pocket of China. Of course, China would go on buying Russian gas. But that would point towards a future which the Russians also dread, though they don't talk about it in public, which is a future of Russia as simply an energy and raw materials dependency of China. So the West, too, does have leverage as far as Russia is concerned, but only, I think, if the West is also prepared to seek certain kinds of compromise.
So we can wrap up with this, Anatol, looking for a possible sustainable outcome, a sustainable solution, because the status quo is clearly not a long-term solution. I refrain from using the word best solution because that all depends on which side you're on. But a Foreign Policy magazine article from 2019 headlined, "It's time for Ukraine to let the Donbass go." Is it your view that one possible outcome here that would potentially settle things would be to have Ukraine split? It would remain one independent nation, but its eastern half would be de facto autonomous, leaning towards Russia?
Well, the Donbass isn't half Ukraine. It's only about a tenth of the country.
Thank you for that.
But yes, I mean, full autonomy for the Donbass is the only political solution. Incidentally, I mean, before 2014, you could find Ukrainian ethnic nationalists who would actually say we'd be much better off without the Donbass and Crimea, let Russia take them, because then, of course, we'll be in a much stronger position to Ukrainianize what remains and turn it into a real Ukrainian nation state. But now, of course, Ukraine has, like India in Kashmir and so many other cases, has nailed itself to this idea that the Donbass and Crimea are the sacred soil of Ukraine and cannot possibly be abandoned. But I think it's worth noting that if this dispute in eastern Ukraine did not involve Russia, if it was in the Balkans or in Africa or somewhere, the West would undoubtedly support autonomy, full autonomy under international guarantees and with an international peacekeeping force. That would be, and also within Ukraine, full cultural linguistic guarantees for the Russian minority. That would be seen as the absolutely natural, democratic, acceptable solution to this conflict. Well, if we're not prepared to push that in the case of Ukraine, it can't be for objective reasons. It can only be because of essentially prejudice against Russia. And I think that's something, given the dangers of the situation now, that is something that we need to get away from.
But as you say, Anatol, nationalism, origin stories, a sense of historic importance or place, they get in the way of rational thinking.
Ain't that the truth? In Russia, too, by the way.
Yes.
Sensible Russians say, my God, why are we risking this for Ukraine? But nobody's wholly rational.
Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Keep us posted on that situation in Eastern Europe. On the next episode of History as It Happens, a new improved 1619 project is out in book form, but it still gets the American Revolution wrong. We'll speak to one of the leading experts on slavery and politics in 19th century America, James Oakes, next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.